Hi, I'm Carl Franklin. Last week on Blazor Train, I showed you how you could improve the performance of your API calls by using gRPC for .NET. In this episode, we'll take the tedium out of gRPC by using two code-first solutions that make it easy for you to add gRPC to your Blazor WebAssembly applications without rewriting your models and services. Now, there are pros and cons to each approach, but after this episode, you'll be armed with all the stuff you need to shave a few hours off your long journey. And I ain't talking about those crappy hot dogs from the cafe car. The secrets of gRPC for Blazor are coming up right now, right here on Blazor Train. All right, so as I said, I'm going to show you two solutions that allow you to add gRPC to your WebAssembly Blazor applications without having to write the gRPC infrastructure. And the first solution is this, protobuf-net.grpc. This is a community project. This is not a Microsoft project. I need to stress that. However, what they do is they take all that stuff that I showed you last week and they hide it from you so that all you have to have is your class and your service, and then it will generate the rest. Pretty cool, huh? But unlike a code generator, you're not going to see that code. It's just going to all work. Now, I've figured out how to use this in a Blazor WebAssembly application, and that's what I'm going to show you right now. So this is actually called a code-first approach, meaning that you've got your person class here, you've got a service, and we're going to actually add the service. And after you have the service, then you just add this NuGet package and a couple of NuGet packages and do a little configuration, and then you've got a client that you can call the service with through gRPC. Now, I'm starting at the same point that I started last week, which is we have an application that has an API layer, and that means we've got a person, we've got a person manager or a persons manager right here. And so this person's manager looks at this file people.json, and which has 5,000 person records in it, and loads it up. That's it right there, people.json, and it loads it up and makes it accessible. And then we've got a controller called persons controller, and that injects a persons manager, and then has a get all and a get by ID. There's the get by ID right there. Now on the server, we need to add persons manager as a service. We're adding it as a singleton service so that we can inject it. On the client, we've got a services folder and an API service that uses the HTTP client to go out and hit that API and grab all the person records or a single person record. And in our imports, we've got access to the models folder and the services folder. And then we've got an index page that injects that API service. And when we click a button, we're going to use that API service to call and get our 5,000 person records. And here we go. And it took, well, 2.2 seconds the first time. Second time it's going to take less, obviously, because we don't have to compile everything. 1.8 seconds. So that's about exactly the same as we had last week when we started this thing. Okay, now just like last week, we have to create a layer of abstraction, a service. So rather than the person's controller accessing this manager directly, we're going to create another layer between the API controller and the person's manager itself. The manager accesses the data. Now we need a service that's sort of like an intermediary. All right, so before we can do that, gRPC, if you remember, requires explicit classes that you can use for requests and replies or responses, right? So it can't take a primitive, an integer, a string as an input, or return a string as an output. It can't use primitives, so you have to have classes for everything that goes in and everything that comes out. So what I'm going to do in Hyperspeed here is to the models folder, I'm going to add those same classes that we had last week. So here is get all people request. And even though it has no properties, we still have to have a class that represents that request. Here's my people reply, which when I call get all people or get all, it's going to return this list of person. So again, I can't have list of person as a return type. I have to embed that in a type. Okay, here's my get person by ID request. Only has one property, ID. Again, I can't pass that primitive ID as a parameter. I have to have a reference type. I have to have a type around it. Next, we're going to add an interface for our service. And here it is, iPeopleService. Now notice these methods are returning value task of T rather than task of T. A value task is a value type, meaning that it isn't a reference type. It is created on the stack rather than the heap. Okay, and it contains both a task and, in this case, a people reply, and in this case, a person. And this is required by protobuf.net.gRPC. Now let's create an implementation of this service in the server application and put it in the data folder. All right, now there's nothing keeping us from injecting our persons manager into this people service. That is not part of the interface. And this is good because this is where I'm actually getting my data. This is a layer of abstraction, meaning that we're just passing on the calls, but we need this interface and we need this service in order to support gRPC. Okay, now that we've got this people service, let's modify our controller to use the people service rather than the persons manager directly. Here we go. So now rather than injecting a persons manager, we're injecting a people service instance. Now, if we're going to inject that, we have to add it as a service in our startup. So let's go do that now. And that's all it is. Services add singleton people service. Now, everything should run just as it did before. All right, the client side isn't going to change. It's still calling the API. The difference is once we get to that controller, here it is, the person's controller, rather than calling the person's manager to get the data, we're calling the people service, which calls the person's manager to get the data. So everything should run just as it did before. Press the button, and 2 seconds later, give or take, we have our 5,000 records. Now that we're at this point, we can add gRPC to the solution. Last week, we did it all manually. And in this first demo, I'm going to show you how to use this protobuf.net.gRPC library to do all of that stuff under the hood. We can still use our person class. We don't have to delete it. We don't have to write a proto file. Everything just gets generated under the hood. So we're going to start by modifying the shared project. Now the shared project is a .NET 5 class library. But instead of doing that, I want to make it a .NET standard class library. So here's what I've done. I've targeted .NET Standard 2.1, and this is just a requirement for protobuf.net.gRPC. Here it is right here. We're adding that NuGet package, and also, very important, we have to add a reference to system service model primitives. We have to pull in that NuGet library as well. Otherwise, this won't work. And this is something that has tripped people up, I noticed, on the internets when dealing with this library. Okay, now to the server project, we need to add a couple of packages. There they are. So these packages are protobuf-net.grpc.ASP.NET Core, all right, obviously server side. And we also need gRPC.ASP.NET Core.web. Now, we used this before last week, but now protobuf-net.grpc.ASP.NET Core is going to use it. All right, because again, everything is gRPC ASP.NET Core under the hood. Now let's move to the client. You need to add a few packages here as well. All right, so here we're adding protobuf-net.grpc, the primitives, and also grpc.net.client and .net.client.web. Here's the thing, gRPC uses HTTP 2.0, right? Most browsers don't yet implement that. And so we've had to fall back for Blazor on this grpc.net.client.web, which uses HTTP 1.1. So just be aware of that the .NET version in Blazor of gRPC isn't going to use HTTP 2. So it's not going to be quite as fast as gRPC with HTTP 2, but it's still faster than Web API, as you've seen. Protobuf-net.grpc requires you to do some modifications, well, to add attributes to your models. So let's start with the person. This is what they're expecting us to do. System runtime serialization data contract. We need this on the class, on every model that you're going to use. And then every single public member has to be decorated with this data member attribute with the order number, the ordinal, if you will. This is field 1, this is field 2, this is field 3. Remember in the proto file last week I showed you that you have to number or sort, if you will, all of the properties. This is 1, this is 2, this is 3. We're doing the same thing here. All right, now we have to do the same kind of attributing to all of the models, including people reply, get person by ID request, and get all people requests. So I'll do that now. Now to the iPeople service, I have to add this particular attribute, service contract. That tells protobuf-net.grpc that this service is going to be used as the contract for any class that implements this interface. So now we have to go to startup and add a couple of things. All right, in configure services, add code first gRPC. And right below app.useRouting, we need app.useGRPC web. And then in our list of endpoints, we have to add our endpoint, people service. Finally, on the client side, we go to program, and we have to do things a little bit differently here. We're going to keep this stuff, but we also have to add support for our new service. So I'm just going to replace this whole thing. And this one's commented, so it's even better. Okay, because I'm using this base address in more than one place, I figured it was a good idea to just go ahead and grab that. This is our HTTP client, our standard one that we were using for everything else. Here's our API service, same deal. And now this is the newness, okay? So we're creating a gRPC web handler, okay? And we're creating a channel from that base address and using an HTTP client from that handler. Finally, we're creating a gRPC service of iPeople service from that channel. And now that is added as the service. So really all we have to do is inject an iPeople service into any page or any component where we want to access that gRPC service. So let's do that now. In index, we'll change this code. We still have our API service, but now we're injecting an iPeople service. We're calling it people client. And we've added the same buttons that we had last week and that do the same thing. We're essentially saying await people client get all. Here's our get all people request. And if we want to do a get person by ID request, we're setting the ID to a random ID, a random number between 1 and 5,000, and pulling that back and showing their first and last name. So let's give it a shot. All right, just for reference, here's our test API. We'll hit it twice. Okay. 1.8 seconds, no big surprise there. Our gRPC, which was really fast last time, is now like 1.2 seconds the first time. The second time, still about a second. That's taking a lot longer than it did when we wrote the code manually. All right, it's about a second, whereas before it was less than half a second, if I remember correctly. And of course, our get random person works just fine. So the trade-off is that you don't have to write all the plumbing code for gRPC, and you can use your own classes, which is great, but you get slower performance than if you had done everything the long way, like we did last week. Okay, and really all we did was we created that proto file, right? I mean, we still have to create our service. We still have to create our request and response. You know, it's pretty good, but this is a code first approach. And I'm not giving you advice whether to use it, whether not to use it, simply showing the data. You make up your mind whether you want to use it. Now, what else can we do? Well, stick around. That's coming up right now. So the next solution is a code generator. I want a generator to create all that infrastructure that I wrote last week by hand, the proto file and everything, and I want it to be efficient, and I don't want to have to give up my class files, right? Just like this last thing that I showed you, I want it to be that easy. However, I want better performance. I want the performance that I had last week with the ease of use of protobuf-net.grpc. So this is an open source project called gRPC Generator. I wrote it, and I wrote it because this is exactly what I was looking for. I was looking for something to I can put in some inputs and it would spit out some files. I could copy those files into my project and everything would work. So rather than reading the documentation to you, I'm just going to do a demo. So I've created a new project called Blazor gRPC Generated. It's a WebAssembly hosted project. And I started with the API only, and I got to the point where I added a service, but stopped short of adding any gRPC code. All right, so if you take a look, here's our person manager, same as before. Here's a people service that injects that person's manager and uses it. Here's my person's controller that uses the people service to return data. Here's my API service on the client, exactly the same. Here's my index razor, and my iPeople service is exactly the same, except that now we don't have to use value task, we're using task. Really doesn't matter, but we're using task. That's not a requirement. So if you take a look, I've got my get all people request, my people reply, right? My get person by ID request, they're all just POCO objects. So I showed you that gRPC generator project. Now I'm going to add that to my solution as an existing project. gRPC wizard library. Now I'm also going to add a console application because that's what we're going to use to generate the code using this library. So let's go ahead and do that. And it's going to be called gRPC generator. Now before I even get started here, I'm going to set gRPC generator, the console app, as the startup project. And I'm also going to add a few project references. We need to add access to the gRPC wizard library, all right, because that's going to generate the code. The shared project, because that's where the models are. And the server project, because that is where the service is. Now, I also need a project reference from the shared project to the library, because the shared project needs to add an attribute to the interface for the service that comes from the library. And also from the server project to the library, because we need to add the attribute from there as well. Okay, now let's go back to our program CS from our console application. And here's what it's going to do. I've got my output folder set to C users carlf desktop output. That's my desktop folder. Okay, I just hard coded it. The service type is the type of people service, which is in the server project. So it's going to use reflection to figure out what all of the classes and models and all that stuff are that it's using. Great. I need to pass it that service type. I need to pass it the namespace of where the models are. I need to pass it the service prefix, people. So that means it will create something called people service. I need to pass it the name of the proto file to create, people.proto. And also the output folder, because what this is going to do is spit out a whole bunch of files and a README file that has specific instructions and put it in this output folder. All right. So unlike protobuf-net.grpc, it's not doing things behind the scenes that you can't see, and it's also not just adding things to your project, which would be really cool for a future episode once that gets written. But what it's going to do is just put it in a folder, give you a README file, tell you exactly what to do, what to copy where, and Bob's your uncle. So before we can run this, however, remember I told you about that attribute. We need it on iPeopleService, right? Here it is, gRPC wizard library.grpc service. And we also need it on the service itself. Now, gRPC generator is a startup project, so I can just run this and it will generate all those files. It's also going to spit out everything that it creates, and we're done. Now, what's interesting is if you go into the wizard library and scroll down to the bottom, I know there's just a lot of string builders and stuff here. Look at this. This is really interesting. I have a method, getLatestNuget which you pass a package name. All right. So what it's doing is it's going out, it's using the NuGet API to go out to NuGet and find the metadata for this particular package name. And I don't want to include pre-releases or unlisted items. And then I look at the last package and get the version and return the version string. And that allows me to generate those package references that we can add to CS proj files, and we know that we're using the latest versions. So let's take a look at the README file that this generated. All right, here's the output folder. So instructions for modifying your Blazor WebAssembly app to support gRPC. So we're going to add all of this to the shared project CS proj file. And I'm going to replace this guy because we're also saying this in what I have in the clipboard. All right, so notice here's our protobuf include people proto, right? We don't have that yet, but we're also adding the latest versions of all of the gRPC packages that we need. Okay, the next thing it says is to add the people.proto file to the shared project, and these converter files, which it also generated, we're going to add to the models folder. So let's do that. So here's my shared folder. Here's people.proto. That goes there. All right, there it is. And now my converters, I'm going to add those to my models folder. Now, why converters? Well, do you remember last week we generated the person class, and we were using the generated person class, and we had to delete our person class because they were the same class name, right? You can't have two classes with the same class name unless they're partial, and don't even get me started there. We need a way to convert the proto message classes that get generated to our classes that we have here, our models. So take a look, starting with people.proto. So notice that all of these classes, if you will, these messages, start with gRPC underscore. And that's how they can differentiate themselves from your classes. So it prepends gRPC to all of the types, including the service itself, right? So gRPC underscore people is the name of the service. And now we have our get all, our get person ID, and all our return types. So naturally, this is all going to happen behind the scenes. The client that we use on the client side is going to accept our types and return our types, but it's going to convert them to the prototypes before sending them and on the way back when we receive the results, the reply. So that's what the converters do. Check out person converter. So we have the ones for lists. So if you want a list of gRPC underscore person, you pass the list of person and it converts it. If you want the list of person, you pass the list of gRPC underscore person and it converts it. And notice that it's just calling these explicit, per instance, per person converters. So here's one that takes a person, returns a gRPC person, and vice versa. And also, look, it's doing null checks. So these converters work for everything that we have here. Here's a people reply converter. Here's a get person by ID request converter. And here's a get all people request converter. Ain't no big deal there. All right, looking back at the README, let's move on to the server project. We're adding these two packages here. gRPC ASP.NET Core and gRPC ASP.NET Core.web. We need to also add the gRPC people service file to the server project. And there it is. We're going to put that in the data folder. Now here's our server-side gRPC service. All right. It uses our people service, which is our people service that we use to access the data, right? And get this, it's accepting the gRPC data types, converting those to our .NET data types, our C# data types, and then calling into the people service, converting the response and returning the response. So again, it's just plumbing. It's just wrapping our people service and converting between the types. Next, we have a few things to add to the startup. So services.add gRPC. Also app.use gRPC web, which goes after app use routing, right? And our endpoint. There it is. Remember, we had to do this by hand anyway, right? All right, on to the client. We have a package, gRPCnet client web, to add to the client project. There it is. We need to add gRPC people client to the client project. There it is in the client folder. We're going to also add that to our services folder. And again, we're converting, right? We have our get all async, which has our get all people request. We convert that to the gRPC version. We call our gRPC people client, and then we call the converter to convert to our C# types on the way back. Now you might think that this is expensive, but trust me, it's faster than what we've done before in the past, and it's not going to impact our performance at all, as you'll see. All right, finally, we have to add these using statements and this code right here to our program CS in the client. All right, so let's talk about this. We're doing the same thing that we did before, except that we're using our generated gRPC people service with a gRPC_people client, and that is what we're injecting. So now what I need to do is just inject this gRPC people client in any page or any component, and we can use this gRPC people client with our C# types, and everything will work smoothly. So let's rewrite the index razor file. So we still have our old API service, that's no problem. Here's my gRPC people client, which we've called people client, and all this code looks pretty much all the same as it did before, except now this code has been generated. People client.getAllAsync and getPersonById async. Now I'm going to go ahead and set the server project to be the startup project, and we'll run this. And wouldn't it be cool if it ran and it was faster than the previous solution? All right, for reference, here's our API. And let's do it twice just to make sure that we have the right numbers. Wow, 2.3 seconds that time. 2.3. I don't know what's going on with my machine right now, but it's a little slower than normal. But my gRPC, 490 milliseconds. All right, 320 milliseconds. That, remember, it was a second with the previous solution. And our getRandomPerson also works just fine. All right, so there you go. Two solutions. One with you not having to write a proto file, and the other with you generating the code for your gRPC infrastructure that gives you more control and gives you better performance. Back to you in the studio, Carl. Now, I just dropped this code generator, so it's still in its infancy. Maybe you'd like to make some changes and make a pull request. That'd be awesome. Oh, one more thing to mention. I'm looking forward to teaching custom in-person or remote training classes in Blazor this year. I'm also just wrapping up a big project, and I'll be free in May to tackle the next one. So if you need me, I'm here. Email me at carl@appvnext.com and start a conversation. Hey, thanks for riding the rails today. This is where I jump off. I'll see you next time. Blaze a trail.